Thus, the way of the world triumphs over what, in opposition to it, constitutes virtue, triumphs over that which is the essenceless abstraction of essence. However, it does not triumph over something real, but over the creation of distinctions that are no distinction. It glories in this pompous talk about doing what is best for humanity, about the oppression of humanity, about making sacrifices for the sake of the good, and the misuse of gifts. Ideal entities and purposes of this kind are empty, ineffectual words, which lift up the heart but leave reason unsatisfied, which edify but raise no edifice. Declamations which specifically declare merely this, that the individual who professes to act for such noble ends and who deals in such fine phrases is in his own eyes an excellent creature. A puffing up, which inflates him with a sense of importance in his own eyes and in the eyes of others, whereas he is, in fact, inflated with his own conceit. Virtue in the ancient world had its own definite, sure meaning, for it had in the spiritual substance of the nation a foundation full of meaning, and for its purpose an actual good already in existence. Consequently, too, it was not directed against the actual world as against something generally perverted and as against a way of the world. But the virtue we are considering has its being outside the spiritual substance. It is an unreal virtue, a virtue in imagination and name only, which lacks that substantial content. The emptiness of this rhetoric which denounces the way of the world would be at once revealed if the meaning of its fine phrases had to be stated. These, therefore, are assumed to be something, the meaning of which is familiar. The request to say what this familiar meaning is would be met either by a fresh flood of phrases or by an appeal to the heart which inwardly says what they mean, which amounts to admitting that it is in fact unable to say what the meaning is. The fatuousness of this rhetoric seems too, in an unconscious way, to have come to be a certainty for the culture of our time, since all interest in the whole mass of such rhetoric and the way it is used to boost one's ego has vanished. A loss of interest which is expressed in the fact that it produces only a feeling of boredom. I had referenced this paragraph number 390 earlier in this commentary by talking about a distinction that Hegel is going to make between virtue in the modern context, in his own time and in, say, maybe the 2-3 centuries before him and projecting ahead, and virtue in ancient times, as he's going to talk about it here. And I think it's worth dwelling on that a little bit. He's going to begin the passage by talking about the way of the world triumphing over virtue, but we'll come back to that in a moment. I don't want to unpack the distinction at the very beginning. I want to think about what he means here by virtue in ancient times. What would that extend to? What would that encompass? So I think that we could read that as continuing through in the West, that time period that was so indebted to the ancients and saw itself in certain respects as an extension of antiquity. It didn't, of course, understand itself in relation to antiquity as such, as opposed to the modern. That comes a bit later. But what I'm talking about here is virtue is understood in the medieval period. It's complicated a bit more because we introduce a explicitly religious viewpoint in there. Not to say that other religious viewpoints are not involved, but Christianity comes on the scene and reworks the ways in which we think about virtue. But for the most part, what he's talking about here in terms of a substantiality is really much more ancient than modern. Similarly, we could talk about understanding virtue as presented in other societies. Societies that may have extended themselves into modernity but have retained that, you might call it, specificity of the nation, of the folk, of the culture, that Hegel thinks modernity has managed to erode, at least in the West. He takes this, by the way, as a historical, not only development, but a dialectical progress of sorts. But when it comes to virtue it's actually reaching a kind of dead end. Now, that does not mean that he's advocating for ancient virtue, by the way. Hegel makes this clear in his philosophy of history that he doesn't think we can actually go back to, say, ancient philosophies. We can't effectively be Epicureans or Stoics or Aristotelians, let alone, citizens of a Athenian polis or anything along those lines. He thinks that is, in a certain respect, a mistake and sort of a regression of sorts. But he's not endorsing modern virtue at this point either. So, all that said by way of preface, now let's take a look at what he's saying. So in the previous paragraphs, we've seen that as with the two previous movements, with pleasure and the law of the heart, what we began with, in this case, virtue, we were going to oppose it to something else, the way of the world. And it looked like virtue had, this reserve that he talked about. Turned out that virtue is not a very good fighter. Certainly not, when it comes down to it, a philosophical street fighter, we might say. And so, like he says, the way of the world triumphs over what in opposition to it constitutes virtue. Now, is this a sad story about the great virtuous knight who is conquered by the evil way of the world? No, because what Hegel is revealing to us is that the virtuous knight was never what he pretended to be, never what he presented himself to himself and also to others, and thereby to the world, as being. Some of the better tendencies were turned against him. What was involved in virtue was an acknowledgement of and a preoccupation with a good that it was thought the way of the world could not attend to. The way of the world was about selfishness. The way of the world was about lesser goods. Well, as it turns out, when the good becomes actual, it exists in the world. It exists in reality. It is wirklich, right? And Hegel saw that virtue had to recognize all of those wirkliche goods in other people and in the ways of the world and its workings. And so therefore the knight of virtue couldn't take action. They could only posture, you might say. There's going to be a lot of discussion of posturing here. So he goes on and he says, what does it triumph over? It triumphs over that which is the essenceless abstraction of essence, the wesenlos Abstraktion des Wesen, right? So essence has become essenceless because it has become abstract. So he goes on and he says, however, it does not triumph over something real. What does that mean? That means virtue. Virtue in the modern world is not something real. It is something ideal. It is, and when we talk about Hegel being an idealist, and idealists, are all about the thing out there, or thing in here, in our heart that is so much better than everything out there. Hegel is not that sort of idealist. Hegel thinks that anything that remains merely ideal is thereby not only not actual, it's not even good. It's not realizing anything. If we wanted to take another famous philosopher's dictum that possibility is higher than actuality, that's not what Hegel thinks. Hegel is more like Aristotelian in that respect. So he goes on and he says, it doesn't triumph over something real, but what does it triumph over? The creation of distinctions that are no distinctions. We saw that in the last paragraphs, right? It glories in this pompous talk. And here's now is where we get the content of this ideal entities and purposes and this rhetoric that he's going to talk about, right? What is the rhetoric? Well, this is familiar territory to us now because we've gone through this part of the phenomenology. It should also be familiar territory to us because people still talk like this in our own time, don't they? This is something you should think about applying. So he goes on and he says, it glories in this pompous talk about what? doing what is best for humanity. I'm going to save the human race. I'm going to straighten things out. Because all those other people are too venial or blinded or whatever it happens to be. They can't step up to the plate and fix things the way that I can fix things. What else? About the oppression of humanity. I am going to liberate people from false consciousness, from their ideologies, from unfair processes that stereotype them, that keep them pushed down. Again, we've talked about this in the past. Social reformers, some social reformers really have sort of emerged from what we call the grassroots in American parlance, right? Others come in from on high, and they're going to fix things, and they go into, say, a poor neighborhood, and they're like, hey, I sympathize with you. I'm going to help. I'm going to contribute to your lives. And these people are like, who the hell are you? Why are you here in our neighborhood? We don't need you to fix things. If we want to fix things, we'll fix them ourselves. Or, if you've got some money to give us to fund stuff, well, go ahead and do that, and now get the hell out of here. I saw quite a bit of this when I was teaching in prison. It was interesting to see, at least at Indiana State Prison, prisoners taking charge of their own moral reformation and being able to see through the do-gooders who would come in and making the big sacrifices for oppressed humanity. They would sometimes, say the right things to these people to get what they wanted out of them, but they despised them. They were like, you people don't have a clue about what's going on or how we're oppressed or anything like that. What else? Making sacrifices for the sake of the good. This is what the virtuous person views him or herself as doing, as subordinating their own individuality. And I'm not denying that many of them do, in fact, subordinate their own individuality. They pass up career opportunities. They, end up screwing up their family life. They end up, losing out on money. They end up losing out on other goods because they're dedicated to trying to change the way of the world, trying to make a difference, as we say. But sometimes that can become, like Hegel's saying, that can become a rhetoric. That can become something that's merely ideal, something that the person uses to tell themselves what a swell guy or gal they are. And he goes on, and the last one, the misuse of gifts. Right? Now that would be both on one's own side. If I didn't use the gifts that I have for the benefit of humanity, I could be using my, let's say we take rhetoric, right? I could be using my rhetorical abilities to make a ton of money in the advertising business or in whatever other business. But instead, what I'm doing is I'm devoting myself to your cause and I'm helping you out. And, this is quite understandable. Any of us who are involved in doing, pro bono work or work for the common good, this is a tendency that we have to watch out for. This thinking that, because we're, using our gifts for the purpose of virtue, which is supposed to be liberating other people, we're thereby fighting the good fight. It's really easy for, the very, selfishness and self-centeredness and promoting the self that we were supposed to be, suppressing or putting aside in order to promote virtue, to sneak in there, and for virtue to be, as Hegel is saying, conquered by the way of the world. The way of the world conquers virtue, not just by standing fast in the face of it, but by encompassing virtue, by showing us that modern virtue actually does end up becoming part of the way of the world. So he goes on and he says, ideal entities and purposes of this kind. Entities means Wesen, right? We just talked about this. The virtue is a wesenlos Wesen. It is an essenceless abstraction of essence. And it bases itself upon, as Hegel says, ideal Wesen, right? Ideal entities, ideal essences, if you like, and ideal purposes or ends, Zwecke. So he says, ideal entities and purposes of this kind are what? Empty, ineffectual words. Now, notice what Hegel is going to do in this passage, right? This is really great. So Hegel doesn't usually turn the rhetorical devices on all that often. If he did more often, he probably would be a little bit easier to read, wouldn't he? But he tends to stay away from that sort of thing. He's engaged in a very rigorous dialectical exposition. But in what comes here, he actually engages in a little bit of rhetoric to talk about rhetoric. He's carrying out a meta-rhetorical move. So he says, these are ineffectual words which lift up the heart but leave reason unsatisfied. Literally, leave reason empty, leera, right? So that's great. And then he says, edify but raise no edifice. And that's a translation of what in German is erbauen, right? They edify, they build up in a certain way, but they raise no edifice, the aufbauen, right? There's no aufbauen going on any sort of basis, any sort of foundation. So this is a very nice way of expressing it, right? Edify but raise no edifice. Declamations which specifically declare merely this. This is what the action of the person is, and the words of the person are really about showing. This is what Hegel's saying. He's unmasking them. He says, the individual who professes to act for such noble ends and who deals in such fine phrases is, in his own eyes, an excellent creature. Now, he's not saying that this is the case at every time. He's not saying that everybody who's striving to do good in the world is a hypocrite. But he is saying that there is a shape, a gestalt, a shape of consciousness in modern consciousness that does engage in this sort of self-deception. And essentially, it's becoming part of the way of the world. We see this over and over and over again, right? We even make movies about this, where the character originally is reacting against some sort of injustice, and they happen to be smarter than the other people in their poor neighborhood, or in their rich neighborhood. They have a nicer heart than the other people in their rich neighborhood, and they've got some talents, right? And all this narrative is going into that, right? And they take the side of the good. And now they have some success, right? Because people are like, hey, we'll help this guy out. He's fixing the neighborhood. He's improving things for people. And then he starts getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And pretty soon he turns into the problem. He's become part of the way of the world. And there's always somebody from his past who's like, hey man, you sold out. You're not who you used to be. You're not for the ordinary person anymore. And they're right. Because at a certain point, something flips. Hegel's saying that this is a danger within virtue. Now, Hegel says that this makes the person a puffing up, which inflates him with a sense of importance in his own eyes and in the eyes of others, whereas he is, in fact, inflated with his own conceit. It's something worth keeping in mind. It's one thing for us to make celebrities out of people who, really don't have much to offer us other than the fact that they have celebrity. It's another thing to say, those movers and shakers who are trying to improve the world and just happen to put out all sorts of videos showing about how much they are improving the world, and then get investors to come in and bankroll them and, get people to nominate them for awards and stuff like that. It's another thing to say that those people are somehow illegitimate or are not entirely measuring up. That's very different kinds of celebrity. But it does become a kind of celebrity, doesn't it? After a certain point, we need to measure whether there's really some substance there. We need to, and how do we do that? We see whether it's more than just ideal entities and ideal aims, and more than just a rhetoric. Hegel goes on and he says, here's where we get to this transition. Virtue in the ancient world had its own definite, sure meaning. Now, why does he say that? This virtue doesn't have a definite, sure meaning. It's trying to figure out what its meaning is in the transition to doing something in reality. It thinks it understands it really well. But the proof of that is putting it into the messy pudding of reality and getting something out of it, something lasting. What does Hegel say? Virtue in the ancient world had something else going for it. It's almost a different kind of virtue. It had, he says, the spiritual substance of the nation. This is where we get to talking about ethical substance, right? Here he's talking about spiritual substance, but we can also talk about ethical substance because the ethical is part of the spiritual for Hegel. And when you've got a society that has some mores in place, you can figure out what's good and what's bad. Let's take Aristotle for an example, right? So people say, well, Aristotle's so dated, and it's an ethics of masters, and these are based on the what we would call the Athenian gentleman, the kaloi kagathoi, right? The beautiful and the good together. That's not really something that appeals to us. That's all nonsense, by the way. Aristotle is in many respects is applicable today. You can think through him in very productive ways. Put that aside for a moment, though. Let's say that Aristotle really was, and let's say we identify him with ancient Athens rather than ancient Macedon, which is, he wasn't from Macedon, but he was from the north. He was never an Athenian citizen. We can go on and on about these historical details. Let's say we do identify him with ancient Athens and its spirit, right? Well, there is something to that. Right? If you look at what he considers virtues to be, the paradigm of courage for him is battlefield courage. It's not necessarily standing up to the tyrant and saying, hey, that's unjust what you're doing. He does, in fact, say a lot of boneheaded things about women, in part because he assumes the kind of society that he's living in, which was very, structured according to gender in unequal ways and didn't allow for development to take place in important ways. Things that he probably would revise today. The very notion of the great-souled or magnanimous person as being at the pinnacle of the virtues. Okay, that, if you read Nicomachean Ethics, Book 4, where he discusses that, you will find a lot of very interesting references to rather specific ways in which this person should exist, should exhibit himself, should act. That's coming from the ethical substance. Now, what was the problem with that? Well, it was restricted, it was limited. And that's why we shifted to something more modern. That's why we got into this whole thing in the first place. Remember back to the very beginning, the introductory section of this portion of reason, right? The ethical substance was abandoned. First, then we have pleasure, then the law of the heart, and then now virtue. So he says, it had in the spiritual substance of the nation a foundation full of meaning, and for its purpose an actual good already in existence. This is something that separates ancient virtue ethics, again, from contemporary talk about virtue, which is not necessarily the revival of ancient virtue ethics, but say virtue as understood by mid-moderns and in say the 18th and 19th century. You were able to point at specific examples and say, be like that guy, right? Now he says, consequently, there's another important thing coming from this. It was not directed against the actual world, as against something generally perverted. It didn't have the same sort of world-negating attitude, fundamental attitude, that modern virtue has, right? It wasn't directed against the way of the world. So he says, we're not talking about this anymore. That's off the scene. We're talking about this. What are we talking about then? The virtue we're considering has its being outside of the spiritual substance. That's part of the transition. And he says it's an unreal virtue. A virtue in imagination and name only. Now that's a problem. It's not an actual virtue. It's a virtue that exists in the person, but not in the person by way of being a habit or being, sort of structure of, or a matrix of relations with other people and the world. It's something that has to be brought about in the world, but it hasn't been. So Hegel goes on and he says, it lacks substantial content, and the emptiness of this rhetoric, which denounces the way of the world, would be at once revealed if the meaning of its fine phrases had to be stated. So what is he referring to there? Lots of people talk about virtue. Just as much as in Socrates' day, anybody can talk about virtue, right? And they're probably not going to get challenged by most people. In part because most other people are, sort of either in on the secret that nobody really knows what virtue is, or they have never thought about it sufficiently, and they're just parroting those words. And in the modern period, we get a lot of people talking about virtue. This is part of why virtue falls out of favor, because people are like, what's here? There's really nothing here for me. Why the hell are we still talking about virtue? Let's talk about something that has substance instead, something that matters, something that is wesentliche, right? So he goes on and he says, these, the fine phrases, are assumed to be something the meaning of which is familiar. The request to say what this familiar meaning is would be met by one of two things. A fresh flow of phrases. Again, we can think back to Plato's question, Socrates questioning people, well, what do you mean by that? And then they regurgitate some more stuff. And he's like, yeah, I don't know that actually answers my question there. That becomes a particularly acute problem in modernity, isn't it? What do we mean? Can we explain it to our satisfaction? Can we explain it to somebody else's satisfaction? Does it matter if we can't explain it to somebody else, if we at least feel that we understand it? Well, that's the second option, right? Instead of just a flow of words, you refer to I've got it in my heart. I know what it is. What does Hegel say about that? He says, the appeal to the heart would inwardly say what they mean. And what does that amount to? Admitting that it is in fact unable to say what the meaning is. That's a problem as well. So he goes on and he says, the fatuitousness of this rhetoric seems in an unconscious way, and now he's talking about his own times and culture, and this is even more so for our own culture, has become a certainty for the culture of our time. All interest in the whole mass of such a rhetoric and the way it is used to boost one's ego has vanished. Now that's being a little optimistic, I think, isn't it? Because this is a perennial issue that keeps coming up. We wouldn't be talking about it today if it wasn't still an issue. But he says our age doesn't believe in this nonsense anymore. A loss of interest, which is expressed in the fact that it produces what? A feeling of boredom. When people talk about virtue, well, let's put aside the word virtue. Let's make it more contemporary. When people talk about integrity, when people talk about goodness, when people talk about making the world a better place, you've heard these phrases over and over again. Do you sort of tune out when that rhetoric comes up? If so, that would be part of what he's talking about here. I think there are many people who are like, that's all nonsense. I don't believe you when you talk about that sort of stuff. Show me what you're actually talking about. Make it actual, not just ideal, and then I'll listen to you. but then we might be talking about something quite different. That is the conundrum that virtue has gotten itself into.